Hello and welcome to episode 7 of the Yes You Coaching podcast. Today we're doing things a little bit differently and it's going to be our first in conversation with session. I've got Catherine Dale and Marlene Henderson with me and we're going to be talking about the confidence gap. So the research suggests that there's a confidence gap that exists between men and women in professional settings, which isn't ideal in 2022. And Marlene and Catherine have both talked to me about this issue before. So I thought it would be great to get them on here and just have a conversation with some other professional women about where and when they've seen this and the impact that they've seen the confidence gap having within their own careers. So first, I'm just going to get you to introduce yourself, tell us who you are and a little bit about what you do. Marlene.
Hi, my name is Marlene Henderson and I am a professional negligence lawyer at Browne Jacobson. I defend mainly professionals except the medical profession. So I'm not a medical professional defender, but I do everyone else. So that's my interesting career.
Cool. And presumably that's for when professionals get things wrong, you're helping to.
Absolutely. When professionals, solicitors, accountants, management consultant, estate agents, you name it, they all get themselves into a spot of bother. And I'm mainly instructed by their insurers who give them professional negligence insurance to act in their defense.
Brilliant. And you didn't start off life as a lawyer, did you?
No, I did not. When I left school, I was brought up in Jamaica, and when I left school, I always wanted to be a lawyer, but the year I left school was the year of Hurricane Gilbert in Jamaica, and that flattened the law school, and they were taking no law students at the University of the West Indies in that year. So I joined the army instead. And spent 7 years of my life having a wonderful military career. Left the army at the rank of captain, now looking back, I wouldn't have done it differently.
Cool, good. Well, it gives you a different, interesting perspective, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you, Marlene. Welcome to the conversation. And Catherine Dale.
Hi, I'm Catherine Dale and I'm a manager in the NHS, is the simple way of putting it. I work for an academic health science network, which is an organisation that helps spread innovation in health and care. It's called the Health Innovation Network and it works across South London. I've worked for the NHS for over 20 years and most of my roles, I don't have a clinical background, which a lot of people who work in the NHS don't, surprisingly. And a lot of my work has been about improving services for patients and just trying to support staff to deliver services even better. And most recently, one of my areas of specialty has been around patient safety. And that overlaps with what you do, Marlene, because that's the unfortunate situations where things have gone badly wrong for a patient. And a lot of that does involve the consequences for the staff who are involved in those incidents. And I'm particularly interested in all of the people involved in those situations and how everybody handles that, which is really complex.
Yeah, and actually it's really interesting, and I might note that for later, because one of the things that I notice around people's confidence when I'm coaching is people's response to mistakes and things that go wrong, because it's inevitable that mistakes happen and things go wrong in anyone's professional career.
Yep.
But the way you are dealt with or the way you actually deal with yourself in those moments is really key to retaining your confidence. And I'm sure you've seen it in clinical settings. I used to be a medical negligence lawyer, and I saw instances where it shattered people's confidence.
Absolutely.
And actually they had to leave the profession or they really, really struggled afterwards.
Yeah, and it's awful that unfortunately awful things do happen in healthcare, and sometimes those things can be avoided, but sometimes even with the best of intentions we've still got human beings and things go wrong, and how that is handled after the thing has gone wrong, both for the patients, the family members, but also the staff, is so significant for the kind of wider impact that has on all of the people.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and how do both of you see that impacting people's confidence? Marlene, have you seen that with
Yeah, I mean, I'll go back to when I made my first mistake as a young lawyer, and it was just simply something being put in the post. I think I shared this story with you, Anna, and
Mm.
and it was something that went into the post, and it was sent to the client's previous address, which was the address that he shared with his now claimant. Um, and when the file was set up, that was the address on file for him. And this letter had put in the post. It was sent to him by email, and it was also put into the post to him. Um, and without realizing, actually the file hadn't been updated with his new address. And my heart sunk. I felt like my world was just falling apart. But luckily for me, my supervising partner at the time said, "Look, let's try and fix this." I was praying like nobody's business. I prayed all the way from the office to home and from home to the office the next morning just to resolve this. And what we did was to catch the post before it got delivered. But my supervisor was like, "Look, it could happen to anyone. Let's just try and get this sorted out." But I can see there are people who fall apart, and I've seen it with junior since, where they make mistakes, and sometimes it's just simple things of an email being sent to the wrong person. Obviously, you got data breach and all those things coming into play now.
Mm.
um, and young lawyers will just fall apart. There's floods of tears and all that. And the worst thing you could possibly do to them when they make mistakes is to not support them, because I'm telling you, everyone beats themselves up when they
Mm.
make a mistake. And if your supervisor or your line manager, or, isn't supporting you at that point, you don't need to kick them. They're already down. No
Mm.
need at all to kick. Just try and get it resolved. And I see people lose confidence. I've seen people wanting to chuck their careers in because they just think, you know what, I'm not good enough to be a lawyer. All sorts happens. But as you say, people will beat themselves up. And the worst thing you could do as a manager or a line manager or a supervisor is to beat them as well.
Mhm.
Mm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the big things I notice when I'm coaching people around confidence, is that if you have a really low tolerance to any mistakes happening, and you really like go in for yourself afterwards, if you really beat yourself up, it erodes people's confidence really seriously.
Yeah.
And because you can't avoid mistakes, and especially if you're doing something new, you're pushing the boundaries, you're out of your comfort zone, not everything's going to go perfectly, and you cannot control everything. But you then get this horrible situation where, even if you're supported externally, like Marlene, you had a great supervisor and they were like, let's just fix this. If what's going on inside is like the equivalent of a terrible boss that just beats you for weeks on end, it really, really erodes people's confidence.
Yeah. And equally, actually, you'll see, and I think there's a slight difference in the way women react to mistakes than men, I think, because when junior lawyers make mistakes, and as I say, when I made my mistake, I was a very junior lawyer. When junior lawyers make a mistake, the women tend to fall apart, and we almost chastise ourselves to the end, and continuously do that. Men will sort of shrug it off a little bit more. Some of them will pretend it's not a mistake, it's just something that happens. Some of them will acknowledge it's a mistake, but then shrug it off quite quickly. But women, actually, we tend to beat and we beat and we beat ourselves to the end. And I think men behave a little bit differently to mistakes than we do.
Yeah, and I guess you've seen that in your professional career, because when you're helping people, there's men and women who are, then that's an interesting perspective. I don't know. I wonder whether that's to do with the way that women are socialized. I don't know. It's an interesting thing to look at.
Yeah, yeah.
So, Marlene, I just wanted to ask you a bit more about, you spoke to me before about the confidence gap that you've seen in the course of your career with people, more junior people coming through. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
So when I say confidence gap, I'm looking at the difference between how young male lawyers, trainees, young junior lawyers behave in the early part of their career versus the women. And this is all about self-confidence, and how self-assessment as well, because we all have to do our annual reviews and we have to assess ourselves. Self-assessment and the imposter syndrome that women mainly face and feel. And so what I see mainly is that there is a difference. I don't know how big the gap is, but I think it's a gap that's noticeable, certainly because I've noticed it. It's a noticeable gap that even men that are shy or even, you know, more reserved, even the most reserved of male junior lawyers are more confident than probably the most confident of female lawyers. And it's a stark difference, because the male are they, even if they don't know something, they'll present themselves as if they know it. And they will profile in such a way that it gives you confidence that they know what they're doing. And very often they don't know any more than their female pair. But the female will ask more questions, will be, even when they know it, question themselves a lot more. And I see that a lot. And I think it has to do with our conditioning, must be why we always have to double check, triple check ourselves. And when you're asked, even as a trainee solicitor, you're asked to assess yourself at the end of each seat, as you know, Anna. And at the end of each seat, a female trainee might be a lot more reserved in the way she would have assessed her own performance during the 6 months in that seat, whilst the male invariably will be singing his own praises. Invariably. And it's a big difference. I think that women are just so much more are we restricting and to give ourselves even any praise for doing something well. Our self-assessment is a lot lower than probably reality versus the men. I think that's what I see.
Yeah. And that's an interesting point about doing self-assessment and praise. When I'm coaching, one of the things I notice a lot is people's reticence to acknowledge any of the good work that they do, or, you know, to even say, yeah, I did that really well. There's a kind of explaining away, like, oh, well, you know, yeah, that was great, but okay, move on. Or a lot of people helped me with that. Or it's really interesting. And I've noticed it quite reflexively in lots of the women that I've coached. And yeah, probably again to do with socialization. Catherine, what's your take on that?
I also wonder if there is a sort of cultural self-deprecation thing going on. The thing that I've been thinking about in sort of planning for this conversation is that we sort of get fixated on, you mustn't be interested in being liked. You've got to just be focused on being respected. But one of the things that kind of prevents me from speaking up at all times is the fear of being annoying, and a heightened awareness of how annoying some people can be. And sort of, you know, how it just seems that some people don't have that filter. And I'm hashtag not all men, but all of that kind of confidence about talking, no matter how bored everyone around you is. I just feel like that the fact that perhaps quite a lot of people have that socially conditioned out of them is a good thing. It's not necessarily a negative, the fact that we've got a bit of, actually, I'm not absolutely fully confident in all circumstances. I just wonder that when we're trying to address the confidence gap, which way are we trying to fix it? Because I think there are some people who are perhaps overconfident rather than kind of trying to get, if we get to a world where everyone is super confident, it's gonna be worse. It's like quite worrying.
And it's an interesting perspective, but in terms of what you've seen, Marlene, is there any reason for your kind of female junior lawyers to be less confident? What is their ability compared to the ability of their male peers?
Invariably, they're on par with their male pairs, and sometimes the females are better, marginally better. So it's not that you are getting the females who are less competent in any way at all to their male counterpart. I think what you see is just the natural way of the way female behave, and the way we behave is we check ourselves, as you say, Catherine. You
Yeah.
check yourself, you make sure that you're conscious of what you're doing, your surroundings, how you're impacting on others. And I think women think a lot more about that than men do, I think. And so the men, as you say, will present themselves in such a way that they're oozing confidence. And we all believe that they know what they're, and you almost believe in their own hype. And you all believe that they can do whatever they are presenting themselves to be doing, and when not necessarily so. And you're right,
Yeah.
Catherine, is whether are we trying to swing the pendulum so women become like men, or are we wanting men to become more like women and be more self-aware and check yourselves and present yourselves in probably a little bit more moderate way? I don't know.
And that's a really interesting point, actually, because when I start coaching women around confidence, a lot of the time, what they think I'm going to do is help them to be more like the archetype of a confident person that they have in their head, who unfortunately is invariably male, and probably is the person that you're describing, Catherine. So they're like, oh, I'm going to be like, I'm going to power dress, and I'm going to like not care what anyone thinks, and I'm going to talk over people. And it's like, but they say, but that really isn't me, and it's not congruent with who I am. And so I don't really want to be like that. And it's like, well, I don't want you to be like that either. There is a confidence which is congruent with who you are and how you want to be. And the kind of leadership and confident leadership that's been modeled to us in the past, I think, is a very kind of male style of leadership, less emotion, get things done. I don't really care about how you feel about something. I will talk over everyone. I think that's kind of how we've been modeled, and I wonder how that impacts on people.
Yeah. I suppose if let's assume for this that men will always behave the way they behave, the way we've been discussing it, and I'd say it's a massive generalization, Catherine, it's really massive, and I hope we don't offend any men listening to this. But if let's assume that will always remain, that the male counterpart will always be marginally more confident than the female counterpart. Let's assume that I think the question for us women, the fact that we don't want to be like that, it's not in us, we don't want to behave like that anyway, should that impact on the way we see ourselves? Because very often it's the impact that it has on us, isn't it? Because we're not like that, and we see men behaving like that, we always somehow come away thinking we're less than. And I think if that impact is reversed somehow in our psychic and the way we see things, then even if the men don't change, the women will change, because the women will see it differently and it will impact us differently, probably.
Yeah, and actually, I wonder whether in the future, like 50 or 100 years in the future, will we even still have that same archetype of somebody who's really confident, or will that have shifted so that even people, because you all have met people, right, who are really quiet, even maybe really introvert, but very impactful, very powerful, and you know that they're really confident. That isn't the kind of overconfidence, which actually I think of as being arrogance rather than confidence. Maybe.
I think, yeah, that makes me what is confidence. And I think, and there is that whole concept of quietly confident, isn't it? The person who springs to my mind is a male person. I remember when I was quite a junior manager, being in meetings and there being some women who would just talk and talk and talk and talk. And there's this one guy who was a sort of peer of those other managers, and more senior than me, and he was very introverted, but when he spoke, you really listened because he had something really interesting to say, and he's gone on to be a chief executive. And so confidence isn't always about being dominant. And I think you can be kind of overly dominant in a space and not be taken seriously. But that's, I think it's really interesting how you come across to other people and what they perceive as confidence, rather than your own self-assessment. I think it's really interesting what you're saying, Marlene, because you've demonstrated how actually asking particularly women to self-assess how good they are at some things might not get a fair assessment if you're if there's not a level playing field for how people even have concepts of that. But if your self-assessment then impacts on what other people think of you, that's really significant as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Because very often what I would have is someone saying, I don't think I'm very good at it. And then you say, well, you are good at it.
Yeah.
Remember when you did X, Y, and Z? And they go, oh, yeah, well, that is it. This is what we are talking about, and you have done it. So don't think that you're not good enough. So, but you're right. It doesn't really impact how, if I'm assessing a trainee, for example, and that trainee is very restricted and moderate in the way she views herself, it doesn't affect how I view her. And very often what I find is I will be saying to her, no, you're actually good at this. You're good at this. You can improve on this. This is what you need to improve on. This is what you need to watch out for. But invariably, my assessment of her is far higher than she would have assessed herself.
Yeah, that's making me think about if you can have like interactions with people in different spaces and they come across differently. I'm thinking now about how I consider people that I work with and don't feel like the way in which they come across perhaps in a bigger group of people reflects how good I think they are. And that then makes me think of when a previous line manager of mine said, you don't seem very confident. And I'm like, it was really surprising to me because at that point in my working life, I think I still was a Labour councillor, and I felt so much more confident than I've ever felt because I suddenly had a status that was associated with that you suddenly had a bit of gravitas and people would expect you to talk and then would listen in a really weird way. Quite challenging for the imposter syndrome or business, but very confidence boosting. So actually I felt loads more comfortable in spaces with quite intimidating senior people because I'd sort of seen behind the curtain and realized that senior intimidating people are just people. And actually there's lots of uncertainty and people blagging it everywhere. So I thought I was more confident, and yet she was saying to me that I didn't seem confident, and I was like, well, what is it then? what is this elusive thing that I need to convey? But it might be that I just wasn't speaking up in all spaces. But like I said, I kind of tried to say before, sometimes I don't always push myself into spaces, but part of that is a deliberate choice of thinking there's enough going on here. There's enough people talking around here. I'm going to bit more pick and choose where I'm going to put my effort.
Funny you say that, Catherine. You and I could morph into one at that stage, because I'm telling you, I mean, Anna would have heard this several times over, where I say to her, I like to stick in my lane. So I keep to my lane, Anna, and this is my lane, and I know what I'm doing in my lane. And there's no need for me to swerve out of my lane, because you know what? Enough is going on over here. I'll let them get on with that over there. I don't need to concern myself, and I don't need to shout up, and I don't need to speak up, because I know what I'm doing over here, and I'll just stick to that. So yeah, I totally get what you've just said, because I've done it.
Yeah. And I don't know whether you want to talk about that, Marlene, but well, I'll just say here, Marlene is currently on the Confident at Work program that I run. And that's one of the things that we've been talking about. And I don't know whether you want to say anything more about what you kind of have thought about that or realized about that as you've thought through it, Marlene.
As Catherine was saying, I think she hit the nail on the head there, because sometimes you're in meetings and there are people, and it's not necessarily men, there's some women too, who just like the sound of their own voices, and they will talk and they will talk and they will talk, and then it gets to a point where I just almost switch off from the conversation. I'm thinking, you know what, enough has been said on that. I might have something probably worthy to say, but I'm not going to bother, because we've flogged this one to death now, and you know what, we're going in this direction. What I have to say isn't really going to change that outcome. I won't waste my time. And I tend to get into that mindset, and I will pick and choose what I talk about and what I don't talk about. And that, well, what I found was I was restricting to these lanes that I was creating, that Anna didn't like my lanes, but I was creating these lanes. And she said to me, well, what if your lane isn't this wide, it's this wide, and it's so much wider? Don't you think you're still in your lane and it's within your remit to talk about certain things? And I reflected on that actually throughout the program. And then you start thinking, as you say, Catherine, don't like the loudmouth. I don't like the show offs. I don't like that. And I don't want to be like that ever. So then I started reflecting on how my lane isn't as narrow as I make it, how the lane could be widened, but still within some confines, because I like boundaries and I like to know what I'm doing and I'm not a show off, how I can make a point without being this show off, always speaking type of person. So I've sort of reflected on that and started to moderate my own behaviors in meetings, to contribute when necessary, to contribute validly, and to give relevant contribution to things, not just speak for the sake of speaking. You'll have people in meetings just repeating what someone else says. Why do that? So yeah.
So frustrating. And I've got another workaround, which is also nurturing other people who you know have really great things to say and helping to amplify their voices, particularly if you know they're in demographic groups that are less likely to speak up. I know I've been really encouraged by other people, both when I was a counsellor and in my professional life. Just a little bit of a nudge and you should say something about that because you know about that can really help. And then you've got a double-edged thing, which is both somebody who is like going to say something really good on the topic, and you're not taking up extra space that you know you don't necessarily have something extra to contribute, but somebody else is.
Yeah.
So I think I quite like putting energy into that, because I do think that the voices that are heard in spaces and in meetings are really significant, and the impact that has on people is really, and there's research that demonstrates that. There's something called the Babel hypothesis, which says that the more people the people that speak in meetings are more likely to emerge as leaders of groups, not just meetings, but in spaces where groups are doing activities. The people who dominate the talking are more likely to emerge as leaders. And there was this has kind of been a hypothesis that's been knocking around for a while, but there's been some debate about whether it's the quality or the quantity of the talking. Turns out it's the quantity. Recent research in 2019 says it's really the quantity, and it interrelates with gender because it does tend to be more men who do more talking, but so it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that then more men get into leadership positions because people see them more as leaders because they're doing more talking. And when you think of how that plays out for so many, not just about gender, but lots of different groups of people and styles of approach, it's something that I've kind of observed, but to see that there's research that indicates that is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And Catherine, you shared some stories about when you noticed this in your political career when you're a Labour councillor. Do you want to tell us a bit about that? Because I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. It predated actually being a councillor, but it was something that I really focused in on when I was, because I just noticed that sometimes you can be in a meeting, and if you count the number of people in the room, there's a gender split that's could be 50-50, and yet if you look at how many people are talking or how much of the time is spent by the voices in the room, it is often, in my experience, much more skewed to the men than the women. And so I'd sort of noticed this in a few meetings, but when I became a councillor, we have council assembly meetings, which are the equivalent of the Houses of Parliament, the kind of Prime Minister's question time, gathering of all of the politicians, loads and loads of speeches, lots and lots of the sort of more political talk, and they were a bit boring. I found them a bit boring, so I'm not a politician anymore. So I got a little bit bored, and I thought, I'm just going to count. I'm just going to do a count of who's doing the talking. And I jotted it down on a piece of paper. And then I told my friend who is a political nerd and really interested, and she was in the audience, and she's a feminist, so she was very interested in that side of things. And then I happened to mention it to a couple of fellow councillors in the pub after a council assembly, and they were just really interested that I'd counted how many people were talking, because it was a really good example of data being like people taking it quite seriously. And so then I started doing it sort of properly in meetings, and people would ask me for the information, and we had a female whip. So the whip, not just people who get in trouble themselves, but they're the people who monitor both the kind of like behavior of the politicians, but they also have, in this case, they were in charge of who got to speak for some of the questions. They got to choose. So Sarah, who was our she was the chief whip. She manipulated things so that more women would have a chance to speak in the meetings. And then we noticed there was quite a lot of opportunities to speak that were more spontaneous, where you had to put your hand up and say something that you thought of at the time, and women seemed to be much more reluctant to do that than the men. So we wondered about whether there needed to be extra training for people. But then the other adjustment that was made was actually to actively ask some of the guys to not speak, to not put their hands up, to allow space for other people to speak. And the very last meeting that I was at, it got to a 50-50 balance of speaking. I don't imagine it maintained that, but it was a really proud moment. Although when you then look at ethnicity, there's a whole another kind of issue again. And it was so interesting as well, because when I moved to my current job, it's 80% women. And I was thinking, well, what's going to happen there then? Because surely you're going to have lots of women speaking all the time, which, yes, most of the time. But what I noticed at the Health Innovation Network is that it still has something to do with status, because in big meetings, big collections of everybody, people with the most senior positions are more likely to talk. Mm-hmm. And so it just felt like there's echoes of power going on through all of this.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what did it do for the discussion and the debate, do you think, that you got to more of a 50-50 gender split?
As in the content of it? That's a really good question. I think that the key for me was enabling people to feel like they had something to say in those spaces, because because that's sort of a given when you're in politics, that you're there, that people, there are sort of status and different roles, but still kind of as a backbench councillor, you've got just as much of a right of speaking than as anyone else. It's a democracy. But it doesn't always feel like that in any space, does it? It's that you still have to look at what's structurally impeding people from having their say, whatever it is, whatever perspective they're going to bring. And inevitably you're going to get different perspectives on things if you encourage different voices to be heard.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I love the fact that you did your own research and data analysis because you were bored in a meeting. That's how it started. Thank God you were bored in that meeting. Yeah, and it's I think that's fascinating. And one of the things that comes up again and again is this point about particular settings where somebody might feel more or less confident. And so many of the people that I work with say, do you know what, one-on-one or with my team, I'm completely different. And it's in a big setting or a senior setting where I don't behave in the same way. I do have stuff I want to contribute, but I don't necessarily. I wonder what it is about those settings that we find really difficult. And I'm just thinking, Marlene, like, you're pretty senior at your firm. How do how does that work for you in terms of how confident do you feel in all of the different settings? And do people need more support as they come through to feel more confident and more secure in those settings so they can bring more of themselves there?
Yeah, I think, yeah, you're right. It varies depending on where you are on the ladder. So when I was a junior lawyer or a senior associate before making partner, I wouldn't speak in meetings at all unless I've been asked something. And then if I've been asked something, I will answer it. But I wouldn't necessarily volunteer to say something about anything, not because I didn't have a view, but because there are others who took up those slots. So, let them get on with it, sort of thing. And you just don't bother unless you were in a small group, as you say, or you were asked directly. And then when I got senior, if I was in a team meeting where partners are meant to lead, then I will contribute to a slot, and you probably would be given a slot which you would lead on. So that's fairly structured. But then if I was in a partners meeting where it's free for all and it's only partners there, then again, I will go back down to that mode where I speak if I have to, sort of, because there are other partners invariably will have a lot to say anyway, and they will let them get on with it, sort of thing. So then I go back to that as if it's just partners, and I will speak if I'm asked the questions or if I'm asked to lead a slot, then I'll fine. But otherwise, I will just revert to let the guys who feel the need to keep going, keep going. So it is, and again, it's not because I'm prevented from speaking or anything of that. Again, it's my own conditioning, isn't it? It's me thinking, you know what, X over there, I know he's going to have a hell of a lot to say. So let him run off and wear himself out, continuously talking. And I don't have to. And if I don't have to, I'm not going to be forcing to get a word in if, there isn't a slot for me to speak. And so I tend to do that. But it's because I do it. It's not because anyone tells me I can't speak or anything of the sort. It's just my own conditioning, the way I go about my business, but not rightly or wrongly. That's a lot of people do that.
Mm. And has any of that changed since you like we talked about the fact that that's what you do, even though sometimes you're like, oh, well, actually, I do have something to say, or I've got a challenge on that. Have you found that there's been any difference?
Yeah. So I say that's how I would do things religiously. It's almost my default setting. So just chill out, let everyone go, get on with it, and you just do what you have to do, sort of setting. But since the coaching, actually, and as you say, there are times when I've got something to say, and I just didn't get a word in, and I just thought, just let it go, sort of thing. Now I sort of, if you go to the meeting prepared to speak, normally I would have gone to those meetings not even prepared to speak. Just think, I know X is going to be going all guns blazing anyway, won't be a chance for me to speak, don't need to even prepare to speak. So my approach now is, if there's something on the agenda that I particularly want to help to contribute to, I will make sure that I get whatever I wanted to say in that meeting, and I would have said it, then I know I've contributed something. Might not change whichever direction we're going in, but at least I feel better about having said something, and then I'm not sitting on the sideline all the time. And so it's almost a preparing myself, conditioning myself to say, actually, I'm going to that meeting's about this, I've got this view on it, I will get that view across, and then the meeting can decide whichever direction we're going in. So
that's so interesting, because that's really prompted me to think about one of the reasons why I feel more confident following being a counsellor is because when I would go to council meetings, committee meetings, I would be expected to speak. Though I would, in order to sort of demonstrate my value and contribution, the only way I could do that would be to say something. So I would have to say something that would indicate that I'd read part of this massive wodge of papers, that I had something to scrutinize or say something about. But I think that then has helped me. I think that's so interesting what you're saying, Marlene, about you can just go to a meeting and not say anything, because there's plenty of other people who will be talking. But actually, so some of us need to put more effort into, yes, but I'm here as well. What are the most important things that I want to say, and how do I almost force myself to shove myself into that space so that I am also heard here, because I can. So I think that is quite important, isn't it? That that those of us, for whatever reason, would have a tendency to shut ourselves down, or that we do kind of actively take up space, and then, as I was saying before, encourage others to do the same, sort of give people a bit of confidence. It's but sometimes you've got to do it quite like deliberately, plan it in advance, like you're saying, and be prepared to slightly embarrass yourself when you first get used to speaking up in places that you're not used to. For me, that's when we used to have conferences in person, the kind of like, has anybody got any questions? The sort of putting your hand up and having a question and trying to get your words out, and it's going to be something that you've thought of at the time. That I try to think of things while talks are going on, so that I will have something to say, because that's something that I don't like. It's quite exposing, isn't it, saying something in front of other people sometimes.
Yeah, actually, that was one of the times where I started counting things, Catherine, and I'd completely forgotten that. So I would go to conferences like away day type things, where there'd be a talk or a particular issue would get talked about, and then it would be questions, like bits of contribution. And I started noticing that the audience, I reckon the audience was more, I reckon it was 60-40 women, men, because in medical negligence, there's more female lawyers, I think, than male, but the male voices would be predominant. So there might be like 8 questions and there'd be one from, and so I said, like, specifically we were talking about something, I can't remember what it was, but it had a relevance. I think it was to do with patient participation and understanding the needs of your population. And you can only do that by hearing from the people who you're actually supporting. And so I said, has anyone else noticed that every time we have a Q&A, it's almost exclusively men who are asking questions? And it was excruciating. I was so embarrassed. I was so bad. I was like, but I thought, I've got to say it.
Yeah.
And everyone was like, shifting in their seats with their suits on. Oh, it was terrible. But the next kind of couple of sessions, more women stuck their hand up, and maybe more men kept their hand down. And you know, I think when you start trying it, it can be embarrassing and it can be really difficult. And it's almost like you kind of have to go in and do that. Often when I'm coaching people, they're like, well, I can't do this because I might go red or my voice might shake and I can't let anybody see that. And it's like, yeah, you can.
Yeah.
The worst thing that they see is that you're having a feeling.
It's the
and that's actually okay.
Yeah, it's the discomfort that you feel when you just do it. You know, you feel a bit uncomfortable. It's not like that's not me. That's not how I do things. I'm just normally the laid back person. I don't do that sort of thing. And then you just think, actually, why don't you? And when you start doing it, then you think, actually, it's not that bad. And if you've got something useful to say it. I will never be the one of those who just speak for the sake of it because I'm too laid back for that sort of thing. But I mean, yes, they are, some people do, but yeah, if you've got something useful to say, people should be encouraged to do it. And as you say, Catherine, it's encouraging my juniors to do the same thing that I do, and to say, well, actually, you've got this point. When we have our next meeting, I want you to make this point because it's a very valid point. You will raise it. I'll prompt you to remind you to raise it, but you need to raise this point in the next team meeting. And it's just getting people used to that sort of thing as well. And the sooner they start doing it, when they get to partner, they are well set into functioning in that way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that idea of bringing people in is really nice, actually. And the other thing that I was thinking is like, when we are in settings where we've got to push ourselves out of our comfort zone, it might be uncomfortable and it might be difficult. We're kind of thinking, we're thinking about ourselves, right? We're like, oh, this is difficult. But what if we think about it in terms of what is it doing that we are creating more representation for women? Like, what did that do in those Labour meetings? Actually, it wasn't about those individual women speaking, was it? It was about what they were representing and who they were representing and what that actually is connected to. And I wonder whether that is also a way of helping people to think about it. Like, why is it important that it's, 50-50 rather than 90-10?
Yeah, it's as you've always asked me, so what difference will that make? What difference will that make to the team if I said something in a meeting? And as you say, it's right. If you don't speak, and if the women normally bring a different perspective sometimes to the men, and if we don't speak up, then it's only going to be one perspective on the table, and never two or three or four that other people could bring to the table. And I think it will enrich everybody. It will enrich the teams out functioning. It will enrich our own performance and enrich our lives because we are hearing from other people doing something differently to how we would have done it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of evidence that organizations that manage to get it right, and they do hear from diverse perspectives, are more profitable than ones that aren't.
True.
So apparently the money talks too. What do you think, Catherine, in terms of the world that you've been in and what you've seen? Like, why is it important in your world?
So I truly believe that collaborative approaches to problem solving and the challenges that kind of face us are the way forward, and that collaboration comes from listening to different perspectives, bringing people together, in creating a space where there's real respect for a range of opinions, and then a way forward is kind of shaped from that. And that only works if people are actively encouraged to contribute. So it's sort of creating that atmosphere where people are really listening to each other as well, because there's something about the person who's happy to just bang on and the rest of us just switch off because it's not engaging. They're just taking up the space because they've got the space, but actually that's not the point of a group. The reason you bring people together to work on something is to get something out of that group. That's not the case for all meetings, but that's the idea of meetings, is that you're getting more out of those people being together than you would if you did something kind of separately. But we don't, it can be so much more of a status game of just like, well, I'm here and I'm saying my thing and you've got to listen to me because I am who I am. And it's just like, it's not, I just don't think people are listening. So that's, it's a bit of a myth, really. But the places where you've got real kind of interesting dialogue and a range of views, and then that leads to something really constructive and action, that's the point of like the work. That's the point of work in the world that is quite a sort of a bit meeting based discussion type activity rather than a factory, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the last question that I've got for you both, and I'm putting you on the spot here because I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this, but in terms of the gender confidence gap, what is your hope for the future?
Well, I think Catherine made me think differently now, because and rightfully so, because I probably would have answered before this discussion. I probably would have answered the question with saying, trying to get women to be more confident, etc., and probably looking at changing our behaviors in such a way that it almost sort of mirrors the male behavior. But actually, what Catherine is right, and has caused me to think, it's not where we want to shift the pendulum. We don't want to shift it for women to become more like the men and exhibit those behaviors. Actually, what we want to say is, even if the men don't change, from my view anyway, even if the men don't change, what we're not going to do is allow that sort of behavior to make us feel any worse than we should feel. And women should actually be believing in themselves, assessing themselves properly. And you don't need to become like the men to be successful and to be proud of what you're doing. Yeah. So that would where I want to see it now.
Cool.
Thank you. I think that it makes me think that approaching things with curiosity is quite key, that people having an attitude of what are the other people in this space got to say, and how can we hear from the people that we might not usually hear from? How do you draw in the most junior person in the room into the discussion, no matter what it's about, because you know what, they'll probably have a really interesting insight. That kind of thinking. So kind of like generating confidence by believing in other people and creating a sense of, I mean, if you suddenly put people on the spot, you're in danger of like really massively making them feel unconfident because they didn't know that was going to happen. So I liked what we were talking about, Marlene, about being prepared. So kind of encouraging one another to be prepared to take up space if we're not used to doing that. But I do think that confidence, it's a sort of two-way street, isn't it? That it's not about puffed upness, it's about kind of like quietly knowing I've got something to contribute here. And that other people are gonna give me some space, even if it's a bit fumbly around the edges, particularly to start off with, that there is a space and a chance for me to say what I need to say, and I'll then pass that on to others as they're learning to share themselves.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. And Marlene. That is, well, that's nearly an hour, so that's what we've got time for today. Thank you both for having the discussion. I loved hearing your perspectives and your experiences and the things that you have come across in your career. And I think that everyone else will enjoy listening to you too. So Thank you again, both. And thank you everyone for listening. And I'll see you again in episode 8.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So after we pressed stop on that recording, Marlene Henderson told us that she never would have agreed to record a podcast before she did the Confident at Work program, which is the program that I run for female professionals, helping people to increase their confidence, which really surprised me, right? Because she is a senior partner in a law firm. She's a very competent woman, and yet she said not in a million years, not if I paid her, would she have agreed to record that podcast. So there you go. That's testament to what you can do when you make a decision about improving your confidence. You can do things differently, even if you've always done things one way in the past. So if you're a professional woman who wants to increase her confidence at work, I'm inviting you to join us in the Confident at Work program. We have a group starting in September, and the group is filling up, but we still have some places left. If you think you would like to improve your confidence, this is the perfect way of doing it. And Marlene is testament to that. So you can look in the show notes and find a way of contacting me there if you want to join us. See you in the next episode.